One of the biggest events in Europe in the biotech sector is without a doubt BioEurope, and this year's event was held in the beautiful German city of Leipzig. As well as lots of colour-coded booths for one-on-one meetings, there were also plenty of exhibitors, so Labiotech had an opportunity to find out about the biotech scenes in Portugal, Greece and Mauritius, as well as to talk to more than a dozen companies about their work.
So I'll explain a little bit about Adrenomed. So Adrenomed is a biotech late-stage development company that's based out of Hennigsdorf, which is just north of Berlin in Germany. Founded in 2009, so it's been in existence for a period of time. And our area of focus and interest really is around addressing the high unmet medical need of sepsis and septic shock, which is, I would say, probably one of the most understated and almost hidden conditions that people don't really know about. People obviously know about cancer, they know about things like diabetes, heart failure, but they don't necessarily recognise that sepsis has more deaths associated than the top 3 cancer conditions combined, which is truly remarkable. And in terms of numbers, as an example, roughly 50 million cases worldwide of sepsis, septic shock. That translates into around 11 million people dying each year, which translates to one person dying every 3 seconds. So by the time we finish this interview, around the world, maybe up to 20, 30, 40 people would have died in that period of time. So it truly is a devastating condition, and our area of focus really is to be able to develop and hopefully have an approved product and then make it available to patients around the world that really need it as well. So in terms of our differences, part of the challenge, as we discussed earlier, around why haven't pharma companies, if it's been that significant an issue like cancer, why haven't companies been able to successfully develop an effective treatment? And what you will find is that sepsis and septic shock, it has so many compounding factors. So previous programs have failed because it's a complex condition, there's not one single thing. My analogy is a little bit like you're on a mountain slope and you have not just one snowball at the top, maybe 5 snowballs at the top, and as they come down they get bigger and bigger, but they're working in slightly different pathways as well. So it's a very complex condition. Also you have this, what we call patient heterogeneity, so that translates into no 2 patients are alike. So just because a patient has sepsis doesn't necessarily mean they will respond the same way as another patient has as well. And that's very similar to what you see in oncology, where you have patients have having worked in oncology, they sometimes refer to it as their own personal flavour of that particular condition, multiple myeloma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. They have different outcomes as well. So if you treat, for example, 100 patients, you'll probably find that 20 patients respond in a certain way, 20 patients don't respond at all, and 20 patients probably respond favourably as well. So that's been another part of the challenge of developing effective treatments in sepsis. And then also animal models, a lot of companies use what I would call the traditional approach, which is, well, we'll take an animal model, just a normal sort of rat study or a murine study, but that wasn't necessarily reflective of what actually really happens in the ICU setting as well. And I think the key one for me really is previous programs didn't target the underlying pathophysiology, so the translation of that is what's at the root cause, what really causes sepsis. And there is some biology happening there, which if you don't target that, you're basically treating just the symptoms of it. So as you know, symptom relief, example, if you have a skin condition or if you have, let's say, allergies, you can obviously treat it with a lotion, but better still is actually taking a medicine that actually targets the cause of the allergy versus actually treating the symptoms of the allergy as well. So taking all of the things together has led to almost a lack of translation, what seemed to be initially promising programs into the clinical setting. So our approach, to be different, is drawing on those 25 plus years of sort of failures, as it were, and then applying it to our R&D programs. And on the basis of that, we've been really able to understand the underlying causality, the pathophysiology of the condition, approach in terms of how we manage the patient heterogeneity, which is through what we call a patient stratification or an enrichment strategy. So finding a way where we can select for certain patients that will respond more favourably to the drug, and also as a result of that, being able to manage the clinical risk. So that's effectively what our program is It's a precision medicine biomarker-guided integrated solution where we use biomarkers to be able to identify the right type of patients and then treat them with an antibody that really targets the underlying causality of the condition as well. Coupled together, we'll hopefully be able to translate from very promising compelling phase 2 data into the phase 3 setting, which then will give us a path forward to obtain a regulatory approval around the world and then obviously make it available for patients that actually need it as well. So that's a very long way of saying this is sort of in a nutshell what we represent and what we do in Adrenomed.
You were mentioning about how every patient responds differently. That must be very challenging when it comes to putting a trial together, because if you're looking for results that are consistent,
yes,
and everybody behaves differently, then it's
yeah, so this basically builds on the theme of the biomarker-guided approach that we take. So to your point, if we say theoretically speaking, let's say we have 100 patients who are in sepsis or undergoing septic shock, what we can then do is we have a biomarker component where we can take blood draws from those patients and look for certain levels of two biomarkers. So one is called biologically active ADM, so this is getting to more of the science, and that has been proven in our research to correlate with outcomes in sepsis and septic shock as well. So if you have a patient with a level above a certain level, you can see actually they are progressing to be in a worsening status. And then there's a second biomarker which is linked to a completely different pathway called dipeptidase 3, which also has been shown to correlate with worsening outcomes for that patient, organ failures as well, and increased mortality. So what we can do is we can stratify the patients for levels of biologically active ADM, they're the target ones, and then also and in top levels of dipeptidase 3, and then you have a sort of an inclusion-exclusion criteria, and then you can select out of the 100 patients the 30 or 40 that, okay, they are the right type of patient selection who have a favourable outcome with the drug. As with all drugs, we would like to treat 100% of all patients, but the reality is they would respond differently, so it's better to really focus on the smaller group of patients, still a representative group of patients who hopefully will have a better outcome. And then once we've shown and proven the technology in that setting, then we can start thinking about expanding it and going from septic shock to, let's say, sepsis and even earlier as well. So that's effectively what we have we demonstrated that in our phase 2 study, and in fact the data we generated based on that patient stratification using those biomarkers led to a reduction in mortality initially of 50%, and then on further analysis looking at additional what we call cutoff levels for one of the biomarkers, we've been able to correlate it with significant relative reduction of up to 67% in mortality as well. So if we can translate that into a phase 3 setting, I think that really is truly quite remarkable.
It's one of the things that, as you mentioned right at the beginning, sepsis is something that people have heard of, but they don't
yes.
realize exactly how big an impact it has.
Yes.
Why is it so difficult to treat?
Part of it is because, the current treatment approach is patients are hospitalized, they go into the ICU setting, they're given a cocktail of antibiotics, vasopressors, and indeed the irony is sometimes the fact you're hospitalized means you're likely to get septicemia or sepsis as well. So even just the physical fact of being in a hospital setting as well. I'll give you an example, and these are figures I cited earlier. If you take the US, every year, roughly speaking, almost 300,000 people die in the hospital because of sepsis, septic shock. And if you quantify the cost burden of that, that translates to roughly 41 billion a year. Again, which is a sick, but the problem there has been a lot of physicians and hospitals say we recognise the challenge, but because we've got no effective treatments to really tackle this, we're a little bit limited. If you talk to treating physicians, one of the common statements to say is, I'm using the same treatment approach I learned about in med school 20 years ago. And so it's desperately needing a new effective treatment to really be able to change that. And based on these sort of market research studies that we've conducted, we firmly believe that as and when we bring the product to market, it really will redefine and reshape current treatment approaches. And it's not uncommon if you have a problem but you don't have a solution, you still have a problem. But if you have a problem and you have a solution, then at that point you think, how do we integrate that into our current best practice as well?
And how close are you to that stage where it's a solution?
Yeah, so great question. So we've obviously generated data in our proof of concept phase 2 study, and now we're pre-planning to initiate the phase 3 study. So this is what we will need to be able to obtain regulatory approval both in the US and Europe. At the moment we're currently obviously seeking funds to be able to initiate the study, so we're doing fundraising activities. Our planning is that we'll be able to initiate the study first half of next year, and then we'll do an interim analysis midpoint 2024, and then we'll anticipate getting data readout in 2025. And assuming that's positive, which obviously we're highly confident, then we'll be in a position to go for marketing application both in the US and Europe. Because of the nature of the high unmet medical need, we believe, in fact, discussions with the regulatory authorities, we anticipate it will go through a fast review cycle. So rather than the usual 210 days in Europe, for example, it will be 150 days. So effectively that's 6 months. So from today all the way through to commercial readiness, making it available, end of 2026, we're looking at roughly 4 years or so from now. And again, that's just a normal cycle that you need to do for drug development as well.
It must be, in a way, a bit frustrating because you know that there are so many people dying from it, and
Yes, and I fully agree. And again, one of the things we're considering is, are there other alternatives? Obviously, we can do a global phase 3 study, but maybe if the data is strong enough based on the interim, again, it's a blinded study, but if there's something there that we think could be meaningful, then that's a conversation to have with the regulatory authorities. The good thing is that the regulatory authorities have accepted the trial design, so the European EMA have accepted at the back end of last year, and then we had a meeting with the FDA earlier this year in the middle of the year, and they accepted a design under the Type C guidance meeting as well. So that's good. So that's a sort of, if you will, an endorsement, not a direct, but it's an endorsement certainly for Europe and also the FDA that the design as it is acceptable for us to be able to move that forward as well.
Are there any other things? I mean, that's a big project in of itself,
Yes.
but is there anything else you're working on?
Yeah, so the interesting thing there is the target that we have is something called adrenomedullin, which is basically part of the underlying pathophysiology of sepsis, and it's linked with vascular, what I call regulation of the vascular tone and integrity as well. But the same target is also linked to other conditions as well, ranging from acute heart failure, also severe infectious diseases. So our planning is, obviously we can validate the application of the drug plus the biomarker in septic shock, also conduct a follow-up study looking at sepsis and earlier in the treatment paradigm for sepsis, but also in tandem we can then consider doing studies in acute heart failure and other conditions as well. So to be blunt, is almost a bit of the tip of the iceberg. Start there and then you can expand it further. In terms of the commercial opportunity, in terms of our projections, we believe that this could have worldwide sales in excess of 6 billion purely in sepsis and septic shock. If you then add in other applications, acute heart failure, endocarditis, all of the above, then you can have a really significant product here. And in discussions we had with potential interested pharma partners, they see this almost as a bit of a cornerstone that they can then use to bring in, build critical mass, and it become a significant growth driver for the business for the future as well.
So is that what you're here to do, make those partnerships?
Yes, so part of the reason why we're here is to engage with potential investors who may be interested in investing into or contributing to the investment needs for our program, and also working with or engaging with potential pharma partners as well under a collaboration licensing agreement as well. And I think we've had a lot of interest expressed because they recognise there's such a high level of unmet need. The data is compelling based on what we've got to date as well. I think the design, people recognise that makes sense as a clinical study design, and the fact that we've also got endorsement both from the EMA and the FDA as well is another sort of stamp of validation, if you will, on top of it. So for us, I think we are very confident that we'll be able to get the financing that we need to start the study, either ourselves bringing it in and do what I call a fully funded unpartnered, and then obviously as and when we get the positive data, I think a lot of pharma companies will be very interested at that point. or working in tandem with a company under co-collaboration agreement as well, with a view to maybe enter into global licensing arrangements afterwards. My personal philosophy is, and I'm very driven by this, it's making a meaningful difference to the lives of patients as well, and that's what compelled me to want to join Adrenomed when I saw the data in the field of sepsis, because when I first heard sepsis, as most people do, they go, oh, that's a very difficult area, many companies have tried and failed, so what's different here? But when I really sort of almost interrogated the actual data, I thought there's definitely something there. So we owe it to the science, we owe it to the technology, and if we can really generally make this available for patients, it will make a meaningful difference in the lives of patients around the world. Not just in the high income countries, for example, US, North America, Europe, but also, as you probably know, when you go to low middle income countries where 85% plus of sepsis deaths is actually there. So ranging from states in Africa to geographies in Europe, in Asia and beyond that as well, Latin America. So I think what I'd like to see is almost moving from initial launches and availability in the high income countries, but over a period of time, and then obviously there'll be other considerations like policy reforms and so on to really make it available for those patients in these underprivileged countries that desperately need it as well.